keep the applause going for our good friend Ken Coates, who's going to come up and share us a research update. Ken's right over there. Let's hear it, everybody. Let's do this.
It's an absolute delight to be here with you again. I'm a real fan of the Prosperity Forum and a huge fan of NACA. Thanks to Shannon and Corey and the NACA group for giving me the opportunity to work on this project for the last couple of years. The goal has been to sort of provide a broader understanding of sort of the nature of Indigenous prosperity and the barriers to that prosperity. And so in some ways I'm summarizing what you've been talking about for the last 2 days. You're going to hear an awful lot of things that I'm saying that other people have said. They're not always all that original. But as I think Kelly said, Kelly's been a good friend from Saskatchewan for quite a while, the conversation around Indigenous economic development has been dominated by poverty for a long time. And as Kelly pointed out, the non-Indigenous populations felt very comfortable in that, very comfortable talking about Indigenous poverty, not focusing on achievement and not focusing on entrepreneurship at all. And I think it's really, really important that we sort of change that conversation. I'm going to look at the evolution of Indigenous economic development over time and into sort of 5 sections. The fall into poverty, because First Nations were not poor before Europeans arrived. The entrenchment of policy becomes a dominant reality in the 1960s, 1970s, and beyond. The battle for re-empowerment, one of the greatest stories in Canadian history, has been the way in which Indigenous people, Indigenous leaders have fought to get their rights recognized, really starting in the 1960s and beyond. What you're in the middle of right now, the Indigenous revival, and it is a powerful, powerful force. And then looking a bit at the path forward. So when you look at this, what we call the fall. I just want to give you some highlights and trail markers. And people have said this already. You know this better than I do. Indigenous communities were successful for centuries. Not a little bit successful, but very successful. One of the largest non-agricultural, most densely settled non-agricultural places in the world was the west coast of British Columbia. This is not a vulnerable, marginal society just barely holding on to the basics. They were actually very, very successful. By European terms, by global terms, by Asian terms, they were successful societies. There was a high level of ecological sustainability. At no time in their sort of last couple of centuries have Indigenous folks ever destroyed a species or undermined sort of the ecology in which they lived. It's kind of interesting because in the first years of contact, you discover that Indigenous people were actually better off than the vast majority of European people. We have this idea the Europeans brought their wealth and dominated through wealth. Most of the Europeans that came over were poor. They were farmers or laborers. They had no money at all, desperately poor oftentimes. And a lot of, it's really interesting, more in the United States than in Canada, a lot of the Europeans who came over were kidnapped by Indigenous folks in battles and then refused to go back when they were freed because they liked living in an Indigenous world better than their own world. And they had huge trade lines. You know, we forget this, that the people of Manitoba were trading in the Gulf of Mexico. That the First Nations on the west coast of British Columbia, what's now west coast of British Columbia, were trading all the way up into the Yukon and up into the Arctic. A huge trade connections going in all sorts of different directions. So far, no fall into poverty yet, but take a look at this. This is actually the decline of the Indigenous population in Canada. There's estimates as to whether there were 700,000 people be here before the Europeans arrived or 1 million. I'm much more comfortable with the 1 million number. But take a look at what happened in the first 100 years of European contact. Most Indigenous populations declined between 70 and 90%. And sometimes that happened very, very quickly. Smallpox just killed millions and millions of Indigenous people around the world. Staggering decline. And you know, many ways, the Indigenous communities are just still recovering from that fall. You think of what happens in the loss of knowledge, the elders who disappeared, that sort of thing. It had an absolutely catastrophic impact on Indigenous people for a very, very long time. To put it in modern terms, if you could imagine an Indigenous community without any of the modern healthcare and all that kind of stuff, having 6 COVIDs happen within 10 years. That's what happened to Indigenous communities. One epidemic disease after another. So why does poverty stay? How does it get entrenched in this sort of process? Very simple things. The newcomers wanted your land. and they wanted the resources, and they felt they could just take them. They were just very straightforward. There were very negative stereotypes about Indigenous people. The missionaries who came there to, in quotation marks, save Indigenous people shared very negative and harsh descriptions of Indigenous society. And the rest of the European world sort of came and said, oh, these people are, you know the words, you've heard them before, they're savages, they're heathens, they're backwards, and they're pagans, all nonsense. The governments, as they came along, supported marginalization. Putting the Indian folks, the First Nations people, the Métis and the Inuit into their back corner was actually straightforward. It cleared the land for the newcomers. So they used treaties and land surrenders. They later on used the Indian Act. And to keep in mind something here that I think is very, very important, that when the treaties were signed, and this goes right back to the 1850s in Ontario, even before then, not so much the ones in the Maritimes, they're quite different, but the treaties all contained a promise, an implicit promise that Aboriginal people would share in the prosperity that followed after settlement. And if you look what happened, the government broke its promises. Not once or twice, but systematically. They promised to do things and didn't do things. And it cost the Indigenous folks enormously, not for 1 year or 5 years, but for 10 generations. And it's had huge implications for society sort of as a whole. And the other thing to keep in mind, I know there's a couple of folks who have been talking about the situation in northern Canada, that as late as the 1950s, most Indigenous people in the far north, northern areas, outside the settlement belts, were actually following a very traditional lifestyle. I go up into northern Saskatchewan all the time, and I'm from the Yukon, and you talk to people there who were adults in the 1950s and early 1960s. They trapped, they hunted, they fished, they moved back and forth across the land, and they described their life in extremely positive terms. They had good lives. These are not desperate people suffering enormous hardship. The closer you got to the settlement area, the higher the difficulties became. A major shift occurred in the 1960s, and it's kind of interesting. Major one, we always think of this in positive terms from a European point of view. What happened in the 1950s and 60s? People were relocated. They took Inuit and put them way up on the far Arctic islands. All across Canada, they took Indigenous people from one area and moved them to somewhere else that was more convenient for government. They created reserves and unreserved housing, and we know how well that's worked out over time. And they created social welfare. And basically, this was seen by the government at the time as a sort of an act of generosity. So what happens? That's the line basically of welfare dependency. The number of people who rely on the government for their main source of sustenance, it skyrocketed. In the 1960s, early 1960s, there were almost nobody, close to zero, Indigenous people in Canada collecting welfare. Very, very small number of people collecting welfare. By the time you get to the 1970s, it's normal. It becomes absolutely the standard way, and it stays till the present. And you get the numbers now where there's some communities have between sort of 20 and 90% welfare dependency. And welfare dependency is crushing. Emotionally crushing, it's desperate, it causes desperate poverty and what have you. There were major limits on starting a business. If you wanted to get support for starting a business, it all went through Ottawa. And Ottawa, we used to say in the Yukon, the Prime Minister, the Member of Parliament for the Yukon used to say that it was 3,000 miles from Whitehorse to Ottawa and 30,000 miles from Ottawa to Whitehorse. And that description actually applies to virtually every Indigenous community in the country. Ottawa did not come to you, you had to beg Ottawa for supports. So what ends up happening as a result of these programs is you get the entrenchment of a major income gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. If you look at the numbers, it's really hard to see the sort of labels there. The top line is actually non-Indigenous Canadians. The one in the middle is sort of the Indigenous population as a whole. But the one at the bottom is the on-reserve First Nations population. And as you look forward in prosperity building, this has to be a real priority. A couple of your youth delegates were actually talking about this today, just a little while ago, about how important it was to reach into all parts of the country. The on-reserve First Nations people are still doing very, very poorly. So what happens then? So in the 1960s, almost from a zero starting point, Indigenous people started pushing for their rights. And you go look at the first major success, the first time Indigenous people used the Canadian court system to get a major recognition of their rights was in 1965, a case called White and Bob versus Regina, where First Nations in Nanaimo, British Columbia got recognition of their right to hunt a deer out of season to feed themselves. on their traditional territories, doing traditional activities, just feeding themselves in a normal sort of way. 1965. And as particularly when the young people are thinking about this stuff, just realize what that generation did. The people from the 1960s to the 1970s gave up their entire adult lives to basically fight for rights and recognition. It took an enormous toll on the people themselves and the negotiations and the conversations and the discussions and what have you. The expansion started really slowly. How bad was it? In 1969, Pierre Elliott Trudeau's government came up with what was called the White Paper of 1969, and the recommendation was that they eliminate Indigenous status. First Nations people would have their status wiped out. They'd get rid of their reserves. They'd turn the reserves into individual pieces of property, and there'd be no more collective rights that Indigenous. And that was seen by Jean Chrétien, who became our Prime Minister, and Pierre Trudeau, who was the Prime Minister, as an act of generosity. Let's get rid of this recognition of Indigenous people as separate or as special or as unique, and actually give them the same rights as other Canadians. Didn't really ask them very much what they thought, but most of them would have said they had no idea or no desire to be like other Canadians, that's for sure. So what happens then? I mean, these maps are sort of interesting to look at. Don't worry about the details. These slides are sort of very general in nature. But almost all, except the treaties that were signed at the government's insistence in the 19th century, we have a whole series of new treaties. Treaty negotiations that started, and the Nisga'a started negotiating their treaty in 1870, and they signed it in the 1990s. Yukon First Nation started negotiating in 1973, and they signed it in 1993. So you've got an entire generation of adult leaders. They're fabulous people who did nothing but negotiate land claims for that whole big 20 or 30-year chunk of their lives. And then you take a look at the map, and you look at, say, those big treaties that have all sorts of new powers for Indigenous people, or regain powers to more accurately. They control big parts of the country. I'll come back to that sort of in a minute. But you also see the development of something else really interesting. This is Indigenous financial institutions. We're working on collecting some background data on this, but it's really, really interesting. Almost all of them developed in the 1980s and 1990s. Somebody said about the 40th anniversary coming up. Well, what happened? Well, this was sort of the second stage. The first thing was getting basic rights. The second thing was signing land claim treaties and getting some resources and power out of that. The third stage was saying, how do we become financially independent? Well, the answer is you break your dependence on any other institutions. You get away from the regular banks and the regular financial institutions. This is the one that sort of is really kind of interesting. So interesting it doesn't want to pop up. Can you do? Sorry, I went a bit too far. There we go. I hope it doesn't skip away. And this is actually just something really interesting. This is protected areas, national parks, and wilderness areas. These are all parts of the country where Indigenous people have special authority over the management of the natural world. And this is a silent one. Most Canadians have no idea. If you want to really freak somebody out in Alberta, go and show them a map like this and say, do you realize that Aboriginal people now have a management role, a sort of a research role, a proprietary role in looking after these lands? And you look at the previous map about Indigenous treaties and settlement areas, Indigenous reserves, added to these protected areas and these wildlife areas, and you realize that Indigenous folks have a whole series of really, really interesting sort of power and authority that they've achieved. So the battles worked. That's the most interesting things. But they worked at a real cost. I remember a comment, in some of you will have heard of the Gitsin-Wet'suwet'en court case that happened back in the 1980s, a court case that the Aboriginal folks sort of won and sort of lost. And I remember one time somebody was complaining about the fact that it was taking so much money to solve these issues, and the First Nations shouldn't be spending so much money. And one of the chiefs asked one of the government people, do you folks have to hold bake sales to pay your lawyers? The answer obviously was no, but the answer for First Nations was yes. And at some point, somebody will look over here and say, where did they take that money from? What did the First Nations not do? So for 20 or 30 years, they did not set up businesses in the way they wanted to. They did not build houses in the way they wanted to. They did not support cultural programs in the way they wanted to. Why did they do that? Because they had to. They had to fight for their rights. And they took a major gamble. Now, the interesting thing about it is they won almost all of the court cases. On the resource side, there's been more than 200 court cases on Aboriginal rights to control natural resources, and they've won 190 of the 200. And it's the reasons governments and corporations are very nervous about Indigenous rights, because the courts keep saying that Canadian law, not Indigenous law, Canadian law says and dictates that they absolutely have to respect Indigenous authority. So look at it this way. This is actually a major investment in the future rights of Aboriginal people in Canada. And these are your grandparents. Instead of them looking after themselves, setting up a business, going to university, getting a training, doing other things they might have well have done, they decided that the most important thing was getting the country to recognize Aboriginal rights. And they fought like crazy to get them, and they won almost all the time. So when you see a court settlement that happens today, or an agreement, a negotiated agreement on treaty rights, they almost all go back to this time period, when the Aboriginal folks fought for the right to recognition. Is actually really, really important. And then we get to what I think, oops, it jumped ahead. Took away the surprise, there we go. What I think is one of the most stunning transformations that we've ever seen in Canada, and that's the rise of Indigenous entrepreneurship. There's not very many benefits in getting old, as you see me sort of creeping up to the stage here and hoping that I can stand up long enough. But one of the benefits, and it's a really good one, is I was there in the 1970s when this all started. In the 1970s in the Yukon, Aboriginal people were almost completely excluded from the standard economy. There was no interest in Aboriginal retail, very few Aboriginal businesses. They weren't zero, but they weren't very many. The government hired very few Aboriginal people. They just marginalized in every conceivable way. And I remember at the time, if an Aboriginal community bought a gas station somewhere in the country, you know, that was actually big head news in the Department of Indian Affairs. They put it in their annual report. They say, Battle Prairie here, Métis community has purchased a gas station. It's a great story. It actually worked out really, really well. But compared to where we are now, this is unbelievable. So it's hard to get accurate numbers about Indigenous businesses, and there's a lot of debate about what constitutes an Indigenous business. You've heard that issue around procurement. This is a monumentally important issue. Indigenous organizations must be in control of determining who's an Indigenous business. No other system will be acceptable, in my mind at least. And it has to be focused on what the community finds acceptable. There are a lot of people whose ancestry is very, very tenuously connected to the present, who are not part of community activities, who are pretendians. Those kinds of things are happening in a whole bunch of different ways. So, but the development was absolutely astonishing. Hundreds of new businesses. Now we're up to thousands of new businesses being developed, and they're growing at a very rapid rate. And you see all the young entrepreneurs who are with us today, and you think, give them 10 years. You know, half of them will fail, but they'll pick themselves up off the ground and they'll start again, and they'll succeed over time. They'll invest in new businesses, they'll hire new people. The development is absolutely staggering. And you can watch sort of really interesting areas. Tourism in British Columbia, dominant by the First Nations there. The growth of Aboriginal involvement in the fishery in the Maritimes, absolutely staggering. From almost zero 25 years ago to a point where there's 1,200 First Nations people working directly as fishermen and boats captains and stuff in that industry. Huge developments. One of the most important to me is the development of Indigenous economic development corporations. These are really a unique thing. You don't have a Saskatoon Economic Development Corporation. You have an Economic Development Office that supports it, but there's no place where I, as a citizen of Saskatoon, have a company that actually is working on my behalf and that I actually own. But in the First Nations community, there's about 400 of them now. The circles represent how much money they have. If you actually, we're in the process of adding up how much this is, but it's in the tens of billions of dollars of assets that Indigenous Economic Development Corporations currently have. And the interesting thing is they don't function like other corporations. Their primary commitment is to building the economy. So if you look up in the northwest corner, up in Inuvik, the Inuvialuit Regional Development Corporation is one of my favorites. They got a $100 million court settlement, $110 million back in 1984. Their current asset base is about $550 million. They've invested in dozens of local businesses, helped local entrepreneurs get off the ground, buy into the industry, and they've invested in cultural activities and other sorts of things. The other part that's fascinating, we can recognize enough the relationship between Indigenous governments and business. And anybody who visits Ottawa for 14 seconds will realize that government is a big business. And there's lots of jobs and lots of opportunities that go along. Some of the self-governing communities, they're communities of sort of 800 and 900 people. They now have 100 jobs for 900 people because they've taken all the jobs that used to go to the non-Aboriginal governments and they brought them home. So instead of having 100 non-Aboriginal people manage your affairs, you hire 100 Aboriginal people to manage your affairs. And the money is now staying in the community instead of going to the provincial or territorial capital, and you're actually starting to get real economic growth. So a couple of things about this. First off, look at the scale here. When you look at the Squamish First Nations, up there around $375 million, and that's small compared to where they're going to be in 3 or 4 years. They'll be well up over the $1 billion in their assets. This is the assets of the government, not the development corporation. But notice the variation. One of the real problems we have in Canada is that many Indigenous communities, First Nation communities, Inuit communities have very, very little money. So some of them are doing exceptionally well, millions of dollars in assets, but way too many are doing very poorly. And it's growing very rapidly. There's actually now 100 First Nations that have self-government agreements. Either have them or in the middle of negotiating them, and they have control of their assets and control of investment. It's really, really kind of fascinating. But look at here again, the numbers involved, and just look at the trajectory. It's really quite fascinating. First Nations win their legal battles, and they actually have governments now terrified. They know they're going to lose. And so the question is, and I'll tell you something really sad, is that very often Indigenous governments of Canada will know they're going to lose, but they won't settle until after an election cycle. They don't want to make a big announcement because they don't get very many votes for being nice to Aboriginal folks, which is kind of tragic. But they'll wait until after the election and then make the announcements because it'll be more acceptable to their political base or what have you. But these agreements are all based on the fact that government broke the law. This is not a charity act. There's not an act of kindness in here. And in many instances, these big settlements have cost millions of dollars. And the communities have spent, Robinson Huron and Robinson Superior agreements, millions of dollars went to lawyers and economists and historians and geographers and all that kind of stuff to make the case that the government broke the law. I was actually an expert witness in the Robinson Huron case. And the fact that the government broke the law was obvious. Like the first time you read the document, you said, okay, they broke the law back starting in the 1850s. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to debate it for 10 years, 12 years actually in that particular case. So billions of dollars of settlements. Some of them are individual. The residential school settlements are in there. The 60 scoop settlements are sort of in there. And some of them are collective. So I'm not sure how many of you will know about the Cows and Plows settlements out in the Prairie West. They signed one a little while ago in the Treaty 4 area, that Treaty 4 and Treaty 6, I think, was $1.2 billion in settlements. Lac La Ronge in northern Saskatchewan, really well managed community with very, very strong an economic base. They have the Kitsaki Corporation that has all sorts of development activities all across northern Saskatchewan. La Ronge Indian Band got $600 million. Now, there's 7,000 people there. It's a fairly large community, but $600 million is a lot of money. And that's the money that's going to go into the ECDEV Corporation. It's going to go into investing in entrepreneurs. It's going to invest in better housing and infrastructure. That is money the community can use to their own effect. This is a massive, massive transfer. So what's actually happening on the ground? This is Government of Canada creates something called a Community Wellness Index. And don't get too excited about this, because this is something that Ottawa created that says this is whether you're doing well as a community or not. There's no Aboriginal content in there. So if you asked Aboriginal people, one of the things they would say is our language strong? Is our culture strong? Well, that doesn't get counted. Or they would say, how much time are people spending on the land? Well, that doesn't count either. So this is very traditional. What's the economy? How much money are you making? What's the educational level? What are the health circumstances? What are the housing circumstances like? So if you look at those sort of numbers there, it's kind of interesting. The top line, big surprise, is the non-Aboriginal population. You'll see that the Aboriginal population has been growing upwards a little bit, and that the Inuit one has stagnated for quite a while and is starting to drop. And I fear that it's going to continue to do so. There's some real interesting challenges there. So what happens here is that some resource communities are doing very, very well. If you went to Fort McKay First Nation in Alberta, the average family income is $145,000 a year and it's tax-free. That's astonishing. It's really interesting in different audiences when I say that, people go, whoa, boo, that's terrible. I hope you were smiling when I said that. What this country needs is a whole bunch more wealthy First Nations people. It doesn't need any more of that indigenous poverty. But what's interesting here to keep in mind is the gap's not closing very much. That period of time you see up there has been a period of incredible government spending. Governments spend more and more money all the time, and they're putting tons and tons of money. In the last 5 years, they almost tripled the budget for Aboriginal spending in Canada, and the gap didn't close. My takeaway from this is, government has to do what government has to do. Aboriginal people deserve healthcare, they deserve housing, they deserve internet, they deserve proper roads, they have fire protection, police protection, and they have almost none of those to a national standard. I spend a lot of time in Scandinavia, and I talk to people in northern Scandinavia and say, well, what's your northern development policy? Well, it turns out they really don't have one. Or perhaps it's easier to say they have a very simple one. They basically say that every community in Norway deserves the same level of service as every other community. So if you're way up in the north, an isolated place in Finnmark, you deserve the same speed of internet, the same medical service, the same doctors, the same education, same quality of roads as you get if you're down southern Norway near Oslo. Pretty simple when you think about it. Anybody been to Northern Ontario lately? Do you think Northern Ontario matches up very well with Ottawa or matches up with Winnipeg or Saskatoon? Not even close. Not even close. So government has been spending the money without spending it the right way. And we haven't really got the real benefits coming in a major sort of way. But in some ways, to my mind, economic independence has taken over from relying on government as being the #1 priority for Aboriginal communities. And the increasing number of Aboriginal communities realize that, and they realize that economic independence supports self-government. And if they want self-government, they have to be economically independent as much as they possibly can. But just to use another model, they haven't necessarily got all of them, but all these things represent Indigenous investments of more than $100 million. Now, 5 years ago, $100 million was a bridge too far. And 25 years ago, $100 million of a single investment was a fantasy. But if you look at the Squamish First Nation, they talked about it the other day, you're looking at something that's probably going to be worth about $6 billion. These are massive, massive developments on a huge scale. And over in the Maritimes, you have the really interesting one with Member 2. Member 2 bought the Clearwater Seafoods, the largest seafood company in Canada. Paid $1 billion to buy the seafood industry. And interestingly, the chief there, Chief Terry Paul, is a wonderful guy. And you're sort of talking to him saying, okay, what's your goal? What's the plan here? He says, well, we just created a platform. So, well, no, you got a company. He said, no, it's not a company, it's a platform. And it's a platform where we make available to every Indigenous community and non-Indigenous community, build your base using us as your platform. If you want to expand the fishery, you want to expand your economy, use us here at Clearwater as your base, which is really kind of interesting. The trick here, and I'm sorry to be the one to tell you that I'm giving away the Indigenous secret, so you already know this, but First Nations are in the process of buying back Canada. And it's kind of interesting that you have to do it. I personally think it's the best and most important development in the last 50 years. Since Aboriginal rights started to get recognized, it's really important. So what's happening is Indigenous groups are buying the infrastructure. Electrical transmission lines, they're buying them all over the place. The solar and other clean energy sort of systems. They've bought huge, $100 million, and one case more than two more than $1 billion investments in the oil sands industry. Huge investments. If you look, one of my favorite places these days is the Haisla First Nation, which is just east of Kitimat in northwest British Columbia. And they just opened up, actually just starting work even this week. LNG Canada has built a $40 billion plant on their land. Whoa, that's something you don't hear very often. But they also are building their own LNG plant. It's about a $5 billion project that will produce billions of dollars of profit for their community in the next 20 to 30 years. Absolutely, absolutely staggering. They're going to own the energy system. They're going to own the transportation systems. They're buying airfields and airplanes all over the place. Indigenous folks are owning tons of hotels. I just think it's one of the greatest and most wonderful, exciting developments. And if you want to gamble, go to an Indigenous casino. What Indigenous folks do is they go after every opportunity. If the door opens a little bit, they race through it. You know this yourselves when something pops up, and whether it's a new mine that's coming in and they have to do a procurement deal or something like that, you folks are sitting there behind a closed door. And as soon as it opens a bit, you push your way through and grab any opportunity you can. The casinos are one of the first ones that came together. But put this in context in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan has 6 or 7 First Nation-owned casinos. Those casinos have already distributed $1 billion to the First Nations in Saskatchewan. Millions of dollars a year, millions and millions of dollars a year go back to the communities directly. And they have the most innovative economic or job creation and hiring processes any companies I've ever seen. So you're going to see some good things. That's the income that basically is attributable to Indigenous people. It's doubled in the last 20 years, and it's going to go up even more, as I'll talk about in just a minute. So where do we go from here? Quite frankly, you just keep doing what you're doing. Keep getting together every year. Talk about how you're succeeding. Support the people who are not doing as well as they want to. Celebrate the ones who are doing really well. And push and push and push. Recognizing that, to put it really bluntly, the government's really not your friend. They're not evil. They're doing the best they can, but their constraints are too strong. They're not really focused on your needs, and they aren't looking at your perspectives. And yet you've got to make your own way forward. But take a look at what's happening here. Remember the population numbers from before? No, hope it doesn't go too far. You see the drop at the beginning? That was down almost, there were only 200,000 First Nations people in 1900. 1921 was the lowest point it got in terms of the overall Indigenous population in Canada. And then look what's happened now. We're actually just a couple of years ago got above, this is for First Nations, got above the number of First Nations that were here before the Europeans arrived. But look where the growth curve is. And interestingly, that population is going to be distributed very, very differently. A lot of the increased population is going to be urban. I use the example of the Inuit. The second largest Inuit community in Canada is the city of Ottawa. Iqaluit's the largest, but the number of Inuit in Ottawa is the second largest concentration. And that's happening all across Canada, in Winnipeg, in Edmonton, in Toronto. Southern Ontario has more Indigenous people than the Yukon Northwest Territories and Nunavut combined. And we always think of the far north as being areas that are Indigenous controlled, but huge numbers in Southern Ontario as well. So we're going to see a huge change. Just the simple number of Indigenous people, the number of entrepreneurs, the need to service those populations is going to grow very, very dramatically. And this graph was actually, this table was put together before the 2025 federal election. And it basically says, here's all the projects that are underway in Canada right now. Now, if you you would have seen the same kind of a thing if you put this up in the 1950s or early 1960s. There were lots of mines, there were hydro projects, everything going on. In the 1950s and 60s, Indigenous people only got the grief. They only got the hardship, they got the dislocation, they got all of the suffering, they got all that kind of stuff. And you go back into the 1960s and look at the number of Indigenous communities that were not just harmed, but destroyed by resource development and the arrival of lots of people in the area, the opening up of fields. One of my favorite stories is because it's so sad, not favorite in a good way, the Lubicon Cree in northwest Alberta. They lived in this really isolated area, and they just kind of ignored the rest of the world. They hunted a lot. Their community shot 200 moose a year. They had lots of food to eat. Everything was really comfortable. Then they brought in the oil and gas industry, and they started creating seismic lines. And the seismic lines started crossing their territory, crossing their territory really quickly. What happened is seismic lines are really good for ATVs. And as soon as they opened up the seismic lines, the ATVs came in and swept out all the moose. And the community of Lubicon Lake went from 200 moose a year to 20. And the people suffered as a direct consequence. It's not all perfect. There's going to be way more development now after the 2025 election. We've got to watch and see what the Liberal government and the other provincial governments do. It's not all good. In the next 10 years, $1 trillion is going to pass between elderly people and their children. Interesting thing here to think about, almost none of this involves Aboriginal folks. Because the generation that's sort of my parents' generation, who'd be now in their 80s or 90s, that generation had very little money. And they're not passing on wisdom, experience, knowledge. They're not passing on very much money. The rest of the population is going to surge. It's very common for my friend group to know people their families are passing on $2 and $3 million to the next generation per child. That's not happening in Indigenous communities very often. So lots of complexity still ahead. Please celebrate the success of Indigenous financial institutions. You have between a 95 to 98% success rate in your loaning. You ignore sort of no standard traditions. What was the word you used about financial literacy? Somebody described it as something different. I think I like that description a lot. I just can't remember what it was. But the financial literacy is twofold. Individual literacy, how to deal with your own money, and collective literacy. The second one is a real challenge, having communities really understand what's going forward. Notice the housing gap. Housing is the way most Canadians get wealthy. It's the way most middle-class Canadians hold on to their wealth and pass it between generations. Because of the Indian Act for First Nations people, because of remoteness, that is actually not happening. Indigenous businesses deal with a really interesting question of a debate between collective and individual wealth. Does the money belong to the person or to the community? That's a debate that the rest of society doesn't have at all. And you have a very unique nature of your business. I think it's actually fascinating. Jump to the next one. You know this because of what you've seen the last 2 days. Anybody who underestimates the strength of Indigenous female entrepreneurs is going to miss out on the most important development of the next 25 years. Indigenous women rule the world already. I think they know that. I don't think most Indigenous men know that yet, and society. But it's true. Indigenous women are absolutely phenomenal in terms of what they're doing because they approach business differently. And much more a social and cultural orientation is about making money. And what's happening is a huge amount of understanding about the importance of long-term investments. We're seeing the big out. That's a forecast of what's going to happen to the Indigenous economy. I think it underestimates what's going to actually occur. Wealth creates wealth. The more wealthier you are, the faster the line sort of goes up as you go along. But let me just finish up with some really quick final thoughts. Just some really key elements. Keep in mind always that demographic collapse. A population that collapses by 90% does not recover in 1 generation, 2 generations, 5 generations. That demographic collapse is critical. Recognize that poverty is a government choice. Indigenous poverty did not have to happen. There was a deliberate choice by government to do certain things. They thought they were doing nice things, but they turned out to be wrong things. Please, as you go through this process, honor the sacrifices of your parents and grandparents. When they stepped forward and fought for Indigenous rights for 25 years, and they weren't home very often, they were actually fighting for the future of Indigenous people in Canada and in your community. And recognize the speed of how much the revitalization how fast it's gone. The change has been absolutely stunning. Keep in mind a few other things. Major changes take decades. They don't happen overnight. Things that happened in the 1960s are showing up now. Things in the 70s showing up now. And keep in mind the downstream sort of impacts as you go along. Shannon, when he was talking yesterday, talked about the fact that he's looking forward to managing prosperity. Managing prosperity is not a thing for the future, it's a thing for today. You saw those settlements. How is each community managing those settlements? Is the money being distributed on an individual basis? Are those individuals being given advice on how to handle sudden wealth? Or the community handling sudden wealth? Some are doing extremely well. It is not an issue for the future. So you as Indigenous entrepreneurs are changing Canada for the better. You're building your own lives. I love to see the stories of entrepreneurs and your successes, and just keep them coming. You're creating personal opportunity for yourself, your family, and your community. More than anything else, entrepreneurs give hope to their whole community in ways that people don't understand. And one of the things, this is the historian in me sort of says, what you're doing is not about today. The work you're doing now is building a Canada for 2050 and 2075. And you might not be around. I know I won't be. You're not going to be around to sort of watch that actually happen. But that's kind of really exciting. And you're giving back in thanks for what your grandparents and parents did for you. So, I finish with this. So many reasons to be proud of what you've accomplished. Please do. Be excited, but also be hopeful. There's barriers to be true. There's no question of that. But this room and this organization, NACA and the IFIs, financial institutions, the young entrepreneurs who are here, hold the key to the future. Indigenous opportunity is essential. Indigenous prosperity is imminent. And boy, has it been fun to watch this happen. Thank you very much.
Ken Coates.